On this week's Talking Politics,
we can send some of our worst violent criminals overseas.
The problem at the heart of Nigel Farage's new prison pledge.
The latest example of one having absolutely no idea how reform is going to fund some very expensive promises.
If he wants a prison in El Salvador, he's going to have a fight with the European Convention on Human Rights over that.
You have to ask yourself how much of this is actually deliverable.
Why was Keir Starmer so unprepared to talk about poverty?
He was told in advance what the agenda was.
Have you got any examples you can give us?
No, but I'll write in and give you detail.
I mean, you almost thought, what on earth's he on?
And why is the Prime Minister's diary such a closely guarded secret?
There were pages from the French government.
Yeah.
Pages of readout. Way more detailed.
And for us, it would be, maybe 3 short paragraphs max?
If that. There is a culture of secrecy still in Whitehall. Their instinct to say as little as possible is really depressing.
Welcome to the show. I'm Paul Brand.
And I'm Robert Peston.
I'm sitting in for Tom Bradby for what is the last Talking Politics ahead of the summer, and a point in the calendar where our politicians are preparing for a break too, of course. Whether hard-earned or not, you can decide that for yourself. Some of the parties are setting out clear messages to linger in voters' minds over the long summer break. So let's review a few of them in turn, Robert, seeing as Parliament will rise. Shall we talk about Reform UK? Because they've had such a big push this week on crime. They're clearly hoping that will be the theme of the summer. What did you make of the announcement yesterday? Should we have a quick listen to what Nigel Farage said first?
We do think dynamic prison places overseas work. You've seen America doing it recently, but the Scandinavian countries are doing it too. I mean, it is quite astonishing that to keep a prisoner in a British prison costs nearly £52,000 a year. You could send a child to Eton for that price. So if we can send some of our worst violent criminals overseas to serve their terms, then yes. And if that means that Ian Huntley goes to El Salvador, well, our attitude is so be it.
He's talking about lawless Britain as the big theme. I mean, the eye-catching bit, or the ear-catching bit, in the sense of a soundbite, was definitely, I think, sending prisoners abroad.
I mean, when I was listening to him, actually, I was thinking to myself, because he mentioned Eton, I thought, is he going to send all our prisoners to Eton? And I thought, actually, they're going to complain under the Human Rights Act if that happens. But
although he's going to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights, because that was one of my first thoughts, was how is he actually going to get them abroad? Because we did a big investigation earlier this year on ITV News into trying to get Brazilian fugitives back to Brazil to face trial there, murderers and paedophiles. We can't even deport those. So if he wants a prison in El Salvador, he's going to have a fight with the European Convention on Human Rights over that. But then, reform policy, as I recall, is to pull out. So,
yeah, I mean, look, there are so many problematic's probably not quite the right word, but there are so many aspects of what was a very ambitious programme that he announced yesterday, where you have to ask yourself how much of this is actually deliverable. I mean, he talked about building so-called Nightingale prisons. I think she'd say that, but poor old Florence Nightingale will be turning in her grave at the idea that her name is being used to, essentially brand temporary, high security.
Not what she was in it for.
It's not quite her values. But anyway, he talked about, building lots of emergency prison places, long-term prison, expanding the prison system massively. All very expensive. It's the latest example of one having absolutely no idea how reform is going to fund some very expensive promises, and how it's consistent with the other thing they constantly say is that they're going to shrink the size of the state. Almost every time they open their mouths, they're spending money, not saving it. Anyway.
Well, they said scrap net zero, for example, didn't they? As one
which
way
is going to save
it.
threepence, as we've discussed on this podcast. The thing, though, that he will have noticed, and which will have definitely given him a lot of satisfaction, which is Nigel Farage, and will have worried Keir Starmer and indeed Kemi Badenoch, is that two newspapers this morning, as we record, right? So this is, we're recording on a Tuesday morning. Both the Daily Mail and the Daily Express splashed on these proposals, which is for him a huge win. And I mean, particularly if you're the Conservative Party, because these are traditionally Tory supporting newspapers, the fact that they are making the judgment that their readers want to know what Nigel Farage is saying on crime, that's a concern for Kemi Badenoch.
Which brings us quite nicely to the Conservative Party and what its strategy will be over the summer. Kemi Badenoch is having this reshuffle, slightly awkwardly for us. It's still going on while we're recording, but we know that James Cleverly, for example, the former Foreign Secretary, is going to come back to a front bench role. She's tinkering with some of the other Shadow Secretaries of State. We don't know at this point what she's going to do with the likes of Robert Jenrick, but nevertheless, the overall aim here for her is to try and regain a bit of momentum, I guess, and to try and improve her top team, to have a bit more cut through and to make a bit more impact.
No, and look, as you say, we're at a slight disadvantage because we don't yet know, as we record, what role James Cleverly will have. But he is one of their best communicators. I think it was a problem for her that, outside of her top team were some former ministers who managed somehow to keep their seats in that wipeout, but, are pretty effective, particularly on television. So it is a bit of a coup, actually, for her that Cleverly is coming back. I mean, I saw him comparatively recently. He was on my show.
I was on with you, remember? And he was...
You were?
Yeah.
And there was... my great sense in talking to him is that he was sort of resigned to being on the backbenches for the foreseeable future. So plainly, this was not something that was being cooked up long in advance. This is a new thing. I mean, the immediate cause of this reshuffle is that the shadow Health Minister, Ed Arger, wrote to her saying that he's been unwell and he needs a bit of time to recover. So she had to do some kind of a juggling of positions because that's obviously a very important post, Shadow Health. But she's decided, therefore, on the back of him saying that he's just got to take a back seat for a period, and we all wish him well in his recuperation, that she's going to do something more ambitious. And I mean, patently, that's the right thing to do. They are still trailing third in the polls. I haven't seen a poll where they're above 20% recently, which is so humiliating for Britain's, for the party that's, either normally in government or the official opposition. So she does need to do something.
I mean, the one person they're not going to reshuffle at this stage is Kemi Badenoch herself, though, and that will be what some people are thinking is actually, if you really want to reset the Conservative Party, they need to change leader, but there doesn't seem to be any big push for that at the moment.
So the risks, so just to pick up on what you're saying, Paul, I mean, the risk for her of doing this now is you sort of have one chance with a reshuffle if you're leader of the opposition to, make a change. She hasn't got, they've got so few MPs, she hasn't exactly got this vast pool of talent to call on. And so if this doesn't work, then she herself will be under pressure. So this is the rolling of the dice. Next, when we come back in September, we move into party conference season. The second aspect of, in a sense, her... Would you call it a relaunch? Since some would say she hasn't even properly had a launch, but whatever you want to call it, will be. She will start at party conference to unveil the sort of big themes of the new Tory party as she moves towards developing a proper policy agenda, because one of the things that is conspicuous about her time as leader is it has been somewhat short of policy. She says, well, so early in a parliament, why would you expect me to have big policies? But equally, many of her colleagues say, but it's very hard for us to communicate with voters if they don't know what we stand for.
Let's talk about Labour as well, because obviously can't leave them out, and they will presumably be having to pedal pretty hard over recess as well with their problems that they've got. The Prime Minister was at the Liaison Committee this week. You watched the whole thing and thought it was pretty interesting. What did you make of it?
So I think we're going to play a clip in a minute or two, which sort of sums up for me what went wrong for the Prime Minister. Now, it's the end of term. You can sort of afford at this stage not to make a sort of mega impact. But I was a bit surprised by what I thought was, at best a very low-key performance by the Prime Minister, and at worst a performance that was lacklustre, a little bit, subpar. And one of the reasons I was surprised is because the Liaison Committee, to remind people, is made up of the chairs of the very important parliamentary committees. These are Parliament's senior MPs. And they'd got together and they told the Prime Minister that they would spend most of, I think it was almost 2 hours at the end of it, they would spend most of the 2 hours talking about how to reduce poverty in this country. So he was told in advance what the agenda was. So I slightly assumed he would come with, if not an array of exciting new policies, at least a compelling vision of how he would drive poverty down. And that's not what we heard from him. What we heard from him was a sort of array, a sort of a range of defensive answers, and I think we should listen to this answers that were just not very convincing. So he was asked, for example, about how he was going to tackle homelessness. There's a terrible homelessness problem in this country, and he came up with this line that within local authorities there was lots of property that could somehow be exploited to help the homeless.
Let's have a listen to that then.
So let's have a listen.
Are you planning to build homes or put people into...
We have to do a number of things. We do have to build, of course.
But that won't happen in the next year.
We have to take over other accommodation. We have to drive down the asylum lists. There is
so
no
just to pinpoint before... what other accommodation precisely are you planning to take over to provide temporary accommodation for families?
Oh, there's lots of housing in many local authorities that can be used, and we're identifying where it can be used. But I mean, look.
Could you give us? Have you got any examples you can give us?
No, but I'll write in and give you details.
Because I could say certainly in a number of our local authorities, I'm already picking up from around the table, there isn't a lot of spare housing available.
Well, exactly, which is why leaving a huge tens of thousands of unprocessed asylum seekers that need to be housed is a huge problem for
so you'll be putting homeless families into those hotels?
No. We're looking at what accommodation is available, and I'll make sure that we send a detailed letter.
Okay, well, we certainly look forward to receiving that detailed note.
I mean, an astonishing clip, not just because he seems to not really grip the homelessness crisis, but also because the government still doesn't really have a plan about where it's going to put asylum seekers. It keeps promising to not have any left in hotels by the next election. But from that clip, you don't get a sense of where they're going to either. So it just...
But it's that statement, which, he said there's lots of housing in many local authorities, just right? Listen. I mean, Meg Hillier's face was an absolute picture.
Yeah.
I mean, she just... you could just see she just thought, what on earth? I mean, you almost thought, in her head, what on earth's he on? I mean, round the table, they all know, because they hear it all the time.
They get emails.
We have a chronic shortage of social housing, low-cost housing. That is one of the big problems. Now, he did also talk in this session about the imperative of building lots more houses. He kept referring to the Deputy Prime Minister as his project manager. I'm sort of slightly wondering how flattered she was by that description. Anyway,
not how she sees herself. I don't think.
But although it is her big passion, building all these houses. But but this was just one example of the Prime Minister just frankly not being altogether convincing. He said, "I will write to you with the details. That was a phrase he used multiple times when faced with questions that, frankly, his team should have prepared him for. It might be worth listening to another clip where I literally felt the temperature in the room drop by about 30 degrees when Debbie Abrahams, the Work and Pensions Select Committee, said, I can't remember exact words, and you'll hear them in a minute, but she basically said that she was ashamed as, a long-standing Labour MP and member at the government's initial Treasury-led proposals to take personal independence payments away from very vulnerable people.
It was so far removed from Labour values of fairness and social justice, let alone compassion and common decency. I have to say I felt ashamed.
1 in 10 working age people out of work and 3 million locked out for health-related reasons. It is no wonder that almost everybody says the system is broken and it's got to be changed. And I'm glad that we've started the process of change. I'm not going to pretend that we got everything right in recent weeks, but we do need to reform the system.
There was just this sort of silence, really uncomfortable. And again, he didn't come back with any kind of proper response. And the one thing he didn't even mention once in looking at this whole welfare issue, and maybe he'd just forgotten about it, but it felt like a Freudian omission. When talking to Debbie Abrahams and indeed other committee members about reforming welfare, he didn't even mention that the minister in that department, Stephen Timms, is conducting a review in partnership with disability charities about how to reform the welfare system in a way that is not going to make vulnerable disabled people anxious and will work with their needs as opposed to against them. But he didn't even mention the one element of the reform package which most Labour MPs would have said is moving in the right direction. So it was a very weird couple of hours. And I think the thing that Downing Street probably ought to focus on in all of this, before we move on, just as the big political point, is I know that the reason these select committee chairs chose this poverty theme is this really matters to them, really matters to Labour MPs, and they were sort of sending a message to the Prime Minister, you've just got to get your act together in this space. And they all came away, because I spoke to a large number of them afterwards, just thinking, they're just nowhere near, this is Downing Street, having a credible strategy. So he's got a big job on this summer.
And also, he's got to meet Donald Trump. So we should talk about that too, because this isn't the state visit we're talking about now, but Donald Trump's coming to he's going to be on Air Force One, arriving on Friday, expected to visit both of his golf courses, Trump Turnberry in South Ayrshire and Trump International Scotland in Aberdeenshire. The President will hold informal talks with Keir Starmer and Scottish First Minister John Swinney. Now, Robert, you established on last week's podcast that bonding over golf is not a strong suit for the Prime Minister. So how will he take advantage, do you think, of his time with Donald Trump?
Well, Downing Street, the last time I spoke to them, which was about this, which was yesterday, it's still all a bit up in the air. I mean, the thing about Donald Trump is, as we know, he makes up his mind about the big stuff and the small stuff quite late.
It's kind of the last thing you need before going on holiday.
And there are things like, I don't even know, whether there are going to be proper political talks, about, the many outstanding issues where we have mutual interests, whether it is, as you know, Prime Minister wants a better tariff deal than the one he's got. There's still 25% tariff on steel. Peter Mandelson has been leading this effort in Washington to try and get a specific trade deal that involves technology to benefit UK tech companies, if at all possible. Separately, the White House, Trump is moving towards quite significant tariffs on the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
We saw only, I think it was today, that AstraZeneca, our biggest pharmaceutical company, is planning to invest tens of billions of dollars in America to try and protect itself from tariffs on pharmaceuticals it ships to Washington. So these massive issues in that space, massive issues around whether we're ever going to get a ceasefire in Ukraine, massive issues around whether we're ever going to get an issue, a ceasefire in Gaza. But despite all of that, these really important questions that you would assume the Prime Minister and President may talk about, we don't know how formal those talks will be. I don't yet know whether there'll be a press conference at the end of it, or indeed even what kind of how informal it's going to be, and whether indeed, as you say, we'll get the traditional, frankly, Downing Street readouts of conversations with leaders are not the most enlightening documents or emails one ever gets, but even that's better than nothing. We don't even know if we're going to get that.
Yeah. In fact, readouts from all world leader meetings are normally pretty boring, except for this year when Donald Trump keeps having his meetings, and then the readouts afterwards can be quite extraordinary.
I guess so, except that actually because Keir Starmer has done so much diplomatic globetrotting this year, and I've been going with him, I have taken quite a close interest in the readouts of other nations about whether it's meetings or what's likely to be discussed. I have to say that the British government is the most secretive and the least revealing of any developed... so, for example, in the recent meeting between the state visit of Macron and Starmer, there were pages of Macron's, from the French government, pages of readout, really interesting stuff about the minutiae of what they discussed.
And this is basically, if anyone doesn't know, by the way, a readout is an email that's sent to journalists, typically in the lobby, in our case, in the UK, after the meeting, just to say, here's a summary of what they discussed. And for us, it would be maybe 3 short paragraphs max?
If that. I mean, it's basically, sometimes it's 5 or 6 lines, and it's things like they discuss the situation in Ukraine. Whereas the Macron one will give you quite a lot of detail about, essentially, what kind of support we're likely to give to Kyiv. So that, also Brussels readouts, again, way more detailed than anything you get. I have to say, there is a culture of, this is probably a long conversation for another time, but there is a culture of secrecy still in Whitehall that is really, I don't think it's good for confidence in the way things are run here. They've honestly got to lighten up a bit and actually put a bit more out there about essentially what's going on, because these are negotiations that affect all our lives, and their instinct to say as little as possible is really depressing.
All right. Well, on that note, let's see how much information we get out of that Donald Trump meeting. Robert, thank you so much. That's all for now. Talking Politics will be back across the summer with regular bite-sized Q&A editions, and Tom will also be popping up with some special guests too, so keep a watch in your feed for those. And of course, if you don't already, hit subscribe on YouTube or any podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for joining us. Have a great summer. Goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.